So thank you everyone for joining again. As I mentioned last, this is this is a series on integral yoga psychology. As I go deeper and deeper into the writings of Sri Aurobindo, I find that it is very important to understand the cosmology that Sri Aurobindo has enunciated and enumerated for our transition from self with a small s to the capital S. Of course, the divine as represented as self with a capital S has become multiple selves. But in order to go from small s to the capital S, it is incredibly important that we understand all that constitutes our small self. And it is here that cosmology becomes extremely important. And what I'm also finding is that as I go deeper and deeper into the cosmology of Sri Aurobindo, I am getting a better handle on the cosmology of some other traditions. For instance, Advaita Vedanta. Advaita Vedanta also talks about Brahma. It also talks about self. It also talks about the self having become multiple. But the difference between Advaita Vedanta and Sri Aurobindo is that whereas Advaita Vedanta talks about Jivatma or Atma, Sri Aurobindo speaks about Brahm, self, Jivatma, and psychic being. The concept of psychic being is completely not there in Advaita Vedanta. What I'm also figuring out is that there is an intimate connection between cosmology and practice. Advaita Vedanta says that Atma is Brahma. When one realizes that Atma is Brahma experientially, one attains liberation or moksha. When you go into the teachings of Advaita Vedanta, you will not get a clear idea of where that Atma is located. Is the Atma within? Is the Atma without? What is the relationship between Atma and Brahma? You don't get that clarity. Sri Aurobindo, however, says that Jivatma or Atma is not within an individual. It is right above the individual. And it is from there that it exerts an influence on the psycho-spiritual constitution of an individual. So standing above, it basically keeps the body, emotions, and the mind of an individual together. In Advaita Vedanta, systematically and experientially, we realize that we are not the body, We are not the emotions. We are not even the mind. And we are able to get in touch with the Supreme Self. What is important is to very systematically undergo the association or the engagement that we have with these three lower planes of existence. When we think or when we say that we are the body, what has happened is that our real self, which is the Atma, has become involved with the lowermost plane. It has become involved with the body. It has started identifying itself with the body. And as long as it is involved or identified with the body or with the physical plane, the limitations of the physical plane is going to influence the self with a small s. There is no escape from it. This physical plane is essentially composed of what, in the traditional scheme of things, is called tamas. It basically creates qualities like indolence and inertia within our being. So, as long as we are identified psycho-spiritually with this physical plane, the visitation of laziness or inertia is going to come to us from time to time. There is no escape from it. It is only when we start disengaging ourselves from this physical plane that we are able to know our real self, which is the witness consciousness, which is the divine consciousness. As long as the involvement is there, the Atma in us, it loses its divine quality and it becomes, or rather, it comes under the influence of the physical plane, which is essentially composed of tamas. Similar is the case with what Sri Aurobindo calls as the vital plane. We need to understand the composite vital plane. If you take the traditional scheme of things into account, the vital plane comes into existence through what is known as prana. If my cross cosmological comparison is correct, within the Chinese cosmology, it is called as the chi. There are similarities between prana and chi. Prana is basically the life force. It is the life force within us. And it is the source of all the dynamism that we contain within our constitution. It contains the source of all our emotions, our passions, our sensations, our wants, and our desires. Extending this analysis a little further, prana is essentially composed of what Sankhya or the traditional Indian cosmology calls as rajas. Once again, as long as there is this identification with the vital plane, with the pranamaya kosha, the self of an individual will be identified with the movements of rajas. However much you may imagine that you are free from wants, desires, aspirations, sensations, and so on and so forth, your individual identity is going to get influenced by all of these. And rajas, as a principle, will keep tossing your constitution from time to time. If you are able to disidentify your consciousness, your your essential consciousness, which Vedanta calls as the self, you will find that you are not assailed by desires, sensations, and so on and so forth. So, the idea here, once again, is to disengage from your emotions. You're not your mind, you're not the emotions. And what this system does is that it first explains to you things intellectually, and then it asks you to engage in a systematic practice, essentially comprising of meditation, which allows you to disengage from this lower plane as well. Sri Aurobindo calls this as the process of ascent. This process of ascent, what it also does is that it leads to spiritualization. When an individual is able to unite with the Atma, which is above the constitution, one attains, according to Sri Aurobindo, spiritualization. And through spiritualization, one will be able to experience the universal consciousness. One will be able to experience the self of all the selves, that one divinity which is manifesting in everyone. But there is an important entity that Sri Aurobindo talks about, which, in my understanding, in my opinion, in my preference, in my predilection, makes integral yoga challenging and fascinating. He says that this Atma, standing above, has a deputy inside the being. It first emerges as the spark of the divine, which he calls as soul. What you will also find in the writings of Sri Aurobindo is that all the terms are very well defined. And this is something very much in consonance with what you find in traditional literature as far as spirituality is concerned. You go into the Yoga Sutras, you go into Vedanta, you go into, any school of Buddhism or Jainism, you will find all the terms very meticulously explained and divined and defined. So it is not, only when we started writing our dissertations for PhD that we started defining our terms. This is an age-old practice. So when we professors say define your terms, it is not something that we are introducing something new into the scheme of things. It is a practice which has come to us from the ancient times. So, what does he do? He defines his terms very meticulously. So, when he says soul, he basically means the spark of the divine which is within the being of an individual. And at this point in time, he is not necessarily talking about the human beings. This spark of the divine is in the cave of one's heart. The Sanskrit term that he uses is Hriday Guhayam, in the deepest recess of one's heart resides this spark of the divine. A particular phrase that we found Dr. Haridas Chaudhary also using in the poem that we read together. Now, this spark of the divine or the soul, through undertaking the process of birth and rebirth, begins to come forward and grow. And it takes the shape of what can be called as the psychic being. This psychic being has a profound impact on our psycho-spiritual transformation. Because here, unlike Advait Vedanta, you are not disengaging yourself from your body, from your emotions, or your mind. What you are doing as you bring the psychic forward is that you are illuminating from within these lower planes of existence, the physical, vital, and the mental planes. It's a gradual illumination that you are engaging in. Now, what does psychic or the psychic being represent? It represents all that is true, good, beautiful, and harmonious in our existence. Now, whether one has deliberately through process brought the psychic being forward or has been born with it, you will find that individual extremely sweet in terms of his behavior and conduct. And this does not come from, what can be categorized as diplomatic sweetness. It is real sweetness. It is the essence, or this is the influence of the psychic on the individual. It is the divine influence on the individual. You can also say that this individual is manifesting his or her soul more and more in the manifestation. You'll find this individual gravitating or attracting or getting attracted towards truth and beauty. And anything which is in reverse of that is met with a recoil. Anything which is disharmonious is not liked by the individual whose psychic is forward. The psychic being within an individual is always looking for harmony and for manifesting truth, beauty, and goodness. Now, Sri Aurobindo also makes a very important distinction. This is the distinction between the outer being and the inner being. I covered this last week, but I see some new faces. So what I'll do is that, I'll give a synopsis of what was covered uh, last week, so that you're able to see, the relationship of psychic being with what I'm going to just talk about. Now, evolution is something that we are familiar with. We all know that it is from matter that life evolved, and from life, mind evolved, and in future, planes that are beyond the mind are also going to become as normal as, what we have as far as mental and physical consciousness is concerned. That is something for the future to be taken care of. Sri Aurobindo spoke about this process of involution. And through the process of involution, he basically spoke about the manifestation of all these planes that became evident through the process of evolution. So before mind became manifest, through the process of involution, the mental plane was formed. It happened when the divine descended into this cosmos, became inconscient, or completely the reverse of what it is in the super consciousness state, and then from there it began to evolve. So all the planes that were formed in the process of involution form our inner being, and all the planes that have been formed through the process of evolution is our outer being. So you have inner mental, inner vital, and inner physical as a part of our inner being, and then you have outer mental, outer vital, and outer physical as part of your surface being. And these, behind your outer being and inner being, lies the psychic being. So when the psychic being begins to come out, it begins to influence your inner being as well as your outer being. Now, interestingly, ego is not a part of of your inner being. Ego is formed as a part of your outer being. For the longest period of time in our psycho-spiritual evolution, ego plays a positive role. I have spoken about this earlier. I've spoken about this aphorism of Sri Aurobindo earlier, also, where he says, ego was the helper, ego is the bar. But after a certain point in time, this ego needs to be transmuted completely in order for the psychic to come forward. As long as the ego is exerting its control over the psycho-spiritual constitution of an individual, psychic does not get a free hand. The ego needs to disappear in order for the psychic to come forward. There will be many different sessions on the psychic being, because the psychic being is very important, for our psycho-spiritual evolution. As I mentioned earlier, what I'm going to do now is that I will read a few paragraphs from Sri Aurobindo describing the psychic being and describing the differences that we spoke about, the differences of of the psychic being with um, Atma or Jivatma, ego, and so on and so forth. So, this is from the Letters of Yoga. He says, this is about the inner being. We spoke about the inner being. The inner being is composed of the inner mental, inner vital, inner physical. But that is not quite the psychic being. I'm emphasizing this, but that is not the psychic being. The psychic is the inmost being and quite distinct from these. The psychic is indeed used in English to indicate anything that is other or deeper than the external mind, life, and body, anything occult or supraphysical. But that is a use which brings confusion and error, and what we entirely discard when we speak or write about yoga. In ordinary parlance, we may sometimes use the word psychic in the looser popular sense or in poetry, which is not bound to intellectual accuracy. We may speak of the soul sometimes in the ordinary and the more external sense, or in the sense of the true psychic. So, what he is saying is, as we described earlier, that the psychic being is different from the inner being. The inner being consists of inner physical, inner vital, and inner mental. And all these planes were formed not through the process of evolution, but through the process of involution. And because they were formed through the process of involution, they are more in contact with the ultimate divine. So sometimes, we intuit things. We do not intuit things only by going above or going beyond the mind. We also intuit things by going within. And when we go within, it is not the psychic being which is giving us the intuition about things, it is our inner being. Now, why is it that that I'm talking about all these different planes of consciousness? In our psycho-spiritual constitution, all these planes are basically meshed up. They all are having an influence on our constitution. Once we begin to understand what is coming from where, we begin to get a greater handle on them. And there is another important principle that the psychic being has, or there is something very important that the psychic does. When the psychic comes forward, it begins to arrange all these different planes and aspects of ourselves around itself. It sort of becomes the center, and it begins to align all these different planes and aspects that we have within ourselves. Very loosely said, as the psychic comes forward, we begin to become more and more together. Because all these different planes of existence, they are not exerting their own respective influences on us. It is not that our mind is saying something, and our body is saying something, and our emotions are saying something, and we are all torn apart, amongst all these different planes. They all get aligned in such a way that they all begin to work in unison with the psychic being. This is one of the important things that happens in our life, as the psychic comes forward. Of course, there are many different ways to bring the psychic forward, but I've been saying this over and over again, that psychic comes forward more and more when we begin to surrender ourselves to the divine which is within and without, divine which is everywhere. The more and more we surrender ourselves to the divine, the more we find the influence of psychic on our being and its various planes and aspects. There are other ways of doing this as well, but in integral yoga, this is one of the best ways of going about things. The being of man is composed of these elements: the psychic behind supporting all, the inner, mental, vital, and physical, and the outer, quite external nature of mind, life, and body, which is their instrument of expression. The outer, physical, vital, and mental are the instruments of expression. But above all is the central being, Jivatma, which uses them all for its manifestation. It is a portion of the divine self. And here, he's using divine as well as self with capital D and capital S. But this reality of himself is hidden from the external man and replaces this inmost self and soul of him by the mental and vital ego. It is only those who have begun to know themselves and become aware of their true central being, but it is always there standing behind the action of mind, life, and body, and is most directly represented by the psychic, which itself is a spark of the divine. It is by the growth of the psychic element in one's nature that one begins to come in conscious touch with one's central being above. So it's a two-pronged process. As the psychic comes forward, you also begin to unite with the Jivatma, which is above. You know, both these things happen simultaneously. When that happens, and the central being uses a conscious will to control and organize the movements of the nature, it is then that one has a real, a spiritual, as opposed to a partial and merely mental or moral self mastery. Self mastery, which is recommended in the process of yoga, becomes more sure, as the psychic begins to come forward. I'll take two more paragraphs and then, we'll open the floor for discussion. It is necessary to understand clearly the difference between the evolving soul, the psychic being, and the pure Atma, self or spirit. The pure self is unborn. Listen to this, this is very important. The pure self, which is the Atma, is unborn, does not pass through death or birth, is independent of birth or body, mind or life, or this manifested nature. It is not bound by these things, not limited, not affected, even though it assumes and supports them. Atma does not undergo any change in manifestation. It is changeless, it is eternal, it is timeless. In a certain sense, you can say it is beyond space, time, and causation, and it retains its essential nature. It is the psychic being that evolves through the experiences that one has in one's lifetime. And it is this psychic being which is born and reborn, as per the understanding of the mother and Sri Aurobindo. The soul, on the contrary, is something that comes down into birth and passes through death. Although it does not itself die, for it is immortal from one state to another, from earth plane to other planes, and back again to the earth existence. It goes on with this progression from life to life through an evolution which leads it up to the human state and evolves through it all a being of itself, which we call the psychic being, that supports the evolution and develops a physical, vital, a mental human consciousness as its instruments of world experience and of a disguised, imperfect, but growing self expression. All this it does from behind a veil, showing something of its divine self, only insofar as the imperfection of the instrumental being will allow it. But a time comes when it is able to prepare, to come out of behind the veil, to take command and turn all the instrumental nature towards a divine fulfillment. This is the beginning of the true spiritual life. The soul is able now to make itself ready for a higher evolution or manifested consciousness than a mental human. It can pass from mental to the spiritual and through degrees of the spiritual to the supramental state. So there comes a time, when the psychic comes forward, it takes control of the outer nature, and it becomes more and more ready for leading a spiritual life and a conscious divine life. One more, and then I will stop. The psychic being is always there, but it is not felt because it is covered up by the mind and vital. When it is no longer covered up, it is said to be awake. When it is awake, it begins to take hold of the rest of the being, to influence it and change it, so that all may become the true expression of the inner soul. It is this change that is called the inner conversion. There can be no conversion without the awakening of the psychic being. So that's that. That's the difference between the psychic being, the Atma, Jivatma, self, ego, and so on and so forth. But as I said, through this, I want to discuss all the planes and the subplanes that Sri Aurobindo and the mother have spoken about. It will raise our awareness, it will raise our mental awareness of these planes. So we need to first understand what they are all about. And by understanding the nature of all these planes and subplanes, we will work towards our own psycho-spiritual evolution in our respective ways. I've been using this phrase in my classes. I didn't do that deliberately, but somehow it has caught on at Sophia University. I would emphasize over and over again uh, the use of mind for the transcendence of mind. We have not used the mind enough for its transcendence. So I've been emphasizing that we need to use our mind more and more so that we can eventually transcend it. When we don't use it enough, I feel that we sort of create a shadow of the mind, which trails us from time to time. So, with those words, thank you very much for joining again. Let's open it up, for conversations. Uh, my idea always is to talk about these things and bring later, towards the end, the writings of Sri Aurobindo or the mother. Today, I just took the writings of Sri Aurobindo, but in the future, I'll be taking the writings of the mother as well. There's a lot. There's a lot as far as the psychic being is concerned. So, we'll have more discussions and conversations on the psychic being. So, thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, Raja.
Well, that was very good. And I feel like I'm getting a handle much more on this material. So I'm appreciating that. Um, I still have to sort of solidify that sequence of the spark of the soul, Atman, psychic being. One question that came up for me is it seems a lot of the anxiety that people have about death is the loss of personality, because it's the personality is where the relationships happen. And so there's something about the loss of those personality relationships and the opportunity to finish those relationships and correct things that didn't happen. And so I think that's a lot of where the death anxiety comes from. So what is the place of personality, of that personal identification that we carry in that sequence, in those different planes of existence?
Yeah. Because the psychic being is individual, what happens um, in the integral scheme of things is that the egoic personality turns into psychic personality. The personality is not going away, you know, but the personality is not identified with the egoic consciousness. On the contrary, it is identified with the psychic consciousness. And psychic is connected to the divine. And the psychic is always looking for the true, you know, for the good, for the beautiful, and harmony. I think, if one comes in contact with one's psychic and begins to make it come forward, then one has a better chance of working things out with others. Yeah, you would want to settle things. You would not want to kind of leave things behind. But at the same time, it also gives a very clear distinction and discernment of what has to be engaged with and what one has to stay away from. As it was pointed out earlier, that the psychic recoils from anything which is ugly. It doesn't like anything which is ugly, either within or without. It does not even like, what is ugly within ourselves. So I feel that, that we are a clear winner when we bring our psychic forward. We start working on things in a harmonious way, uh, with entities, things that are on the outside. And at the same time, we begin to transform what needs to be transformed within ourselves. So that's how I see it. And I say, and I feel that, that psychic begins to give a more fulfilling life. It grounds you. You feel the sweetness within. It feels as if, it has taken control of your entire being. So yeah, instead of uh, getting the fear activated, I would say that it will it will bring profound results. Everything which is supposed to stay will stay, you know. See, the beauty of this yoga is that this is world participating yoga. You know, we are not in the pursuit of divine, which we are not going away from anything. Everything has to be engaged with and transformed. You know, from the perspective of my preference and predilection, this is very fulfilling. When my spiritual pursuit happened, you know, one of the things which kept me away from many traditions, you know, with which I identified quite a bit, was this particular angle, remaining connected with the world. I did not want to leave the world the way it was and go away, you know. So I hope that shed some light on what you stated, Roger. Questions, comments?
Yes. So, Kundan, you spoke of the central being. Could you elaborate a little bit more on what you mean by the central being?
Yeah. The central being is Jivatma.
Ah,
You know, Atma standing above one's constitution,
hmm,
which is the reflection of the divine,
yeah,
you know.
yeah,
So this reflection of the divine is the central being which is standing above the constitution, which has its due deputy, which is within us. You know, the soul, which in the process of evolution becomes the psychic being.
yeah. That's nice.
Hi, Vladimir. Nice to see you.
Uh, hi, nice to nice to meet you here, and it's a very good lecture. And I have just you mentioned about the psychic being, and you mentioned that the psychic being is a good, is beautiful, is virtuous. So my question is, just according to mm, the just the Chinese traditional, they have the idea about the Taoism. They have idea about the dialectical thought. So my question is about the psychic being. Why it only the positive or the beauty things of the psychic being, and yeah, there's no other. So I want to know why you have that idea, just conviction of the psychic being is a good fortune, the beautiful things. Just like
Thank
yeah.
you. Beautiful question. Beautiful question. So you know, when you look at the Indian tradition, you know, or I should say the Indian traditions, right from the very beginning, you know, right from the Vedas, there is a lot of emphasis, you know, on the transcendence of binaries, transcendence of dualities. So, you know, and I am no expert, you know, in Chinese cosmology, so please forgive my ignorance, you know, but whatever little that I understand, you know, of the cosmology, when you look at, you know, the symbolism of yin and yang, you know, you see them in interaction, and as you rightly pointed out, you know, in a dialectical relationship, you know, it's uh, it's an interaction going on uh, between the two. Now, within the Indian tradition, of course, you know, dialectics is spoken about as far as the binary halves or the dual halves are concerned. But there's also a state, which a practitioner is supposed to um, come to, where all binaries completely collapse. They don't exist, and there's a very stringent intellectual exercise with respect to that. Like, for instance, Nagarjuna, one Mahayan Buddhist philosopher of uh, the second century BCE, says that if A is a truth contention, then mind can take one or more of the following positions. I'm, I'm giving them out to you. Uh, let's follow them very carefully. A is true. That's contention number one. A is false. That is contention number two. Contention number three is A is both false and true. Number four, A is neither false nor not true. Particularly, the latter two, they begin to confuse one's mind like anything. And the more one engages with this, the more one begins to find that the mind begins to lose its hold on our consciousness. So there is that slight difference. Of course, dialectics also is spoken about within the tradition, but there is something beyond which is spoken about, you know, um, in dialectics in this tradition. Let me explain this to you with an example. Happy and sad, right, is a binary. Now, beyond this binary is what the tradition describes as bliss. The bliss does not have its opposite. Sadness is the opposite of happiness. Happiness is the opposite of sadness. But beyond this is that bliss. So, I was talking about the influence of cosmology on practices. And when we look at practices, from the perspective of cosmologies, then spiritual pursuits become very, very interesting. There's a correspondence between cosmology and practice. The more we understand cosmology, the more we understand practice, the more we engage in practice, the more, you know, cosmology comes into our awareness or knowledge. Does that address your question?
Yeah, yeah, thank you. It seems like it is below to a higher level and without the boundaries and more. So that is a pure world, something like that, non-duality. So maybe it's different level of the of the
Or
whole.
we can say it is different,
Yes,
instead of
yes.
instead of putting that in an hierarchy, we can say it's different.
Okay, yeah, I got it. And another question is about the psychic being. If person can attain that status, so what is a person will come back to the normal life and I mean just when the people attain the psychics being status in the just when he come back to the normal daily life, does he will lose that status or he will keep that status and will not lose it anymore? So
Now, that's a good question. See, initially what happens is that one goes back and forth, but through
yeah,
practice, it becomes more and more, um, constant, if you will. One doesn't lose, one's contact with the psychic. Even one is engaged in external things,
Mm.
the presence of psychic is always operating. In a certain sense, you can say that there's one eye which is always looking at one's inner being, or and here when I say inner being, I'm not talking about the inner being comprising of inner, mental, physical, or vital. I'm talking about the psychic being. One has one's eye on the psychic being all the time, and sort of making this comparison. You know, are one's actions in tandem with the dictates of the psychic being, or is one moving away, from what the psychic being would have preferred?
Okay. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I would like to, it's a very fundamental and profound topic. Thank you so much, Kundan, for kind of laying out the whole kind of paradigm. It's important. And since Yali Lee addressed this topic again, why this beauty and why not another beauty? What is interesting that the whole nature, it came to me, what Mother describes, the whole earthly nature is charged with psychic presence. When you take the body on earth, physical body, human body, you receive the psychic presence. And even if you didn't have any soul, any spark from before, you will develop it and you start growing within yourself that divine presence. And this is something unique for earth alone. And actually, she even mentioned in this regard Chinese, who came for that purpose as a particular race of people to gain this divine presence within themselves. And over time, they developed that presence and sense of it. As I remember I'm sure Marta also can add to it, and many more people here. It's a very interesting question for Chinese also, because she mentions them with regard to this topic of psychic being growing from within. So just wanted to add this small bit.
Thank you.
Comments, questions? If not, then we can have a brief meditation and close.
I had a quick question. I want to thank you again for your presentation. It really helps with my understanding. And would it be correct to think that it's the development of the psychic being that is the impetus for the transformation of the planes of mind? And then I'm wondering if that's an active process or more of a result.
Where one is situating oneself. The push, and the pull are always there. It depends, whether it's the planes that are above the mind that are pulling oneself, or it is the psychic, which is giving the push. So it will, it will vary, and this is where constitutions become extremely important in the practice of the yoga. How is one constituted? What are the pushes and pulls that one has? As I said, I was not interested in the process of spiritualization. I was this whole process of of disengaging myself, from my body, my emotions, and um, my mind, did not really work. I'm, yes, in the process of ascent that is going to happen, but I'm more interested, you know, um, in the process of the transformation of the lower beings through bringing the psychic forward. The process of psychization works more for me, you know. I'm essentially and fundamentally a devotee of the mother, you know. That's basically who I am. And it's the process of love, it's a process of surrender, you know, it's a process of taking my psychic to her over and over again, which I feel has basically worked in my life. Everything else, you know, is basically what we say within the Indian context, you know, her prasad, her gift. So let's meditate, and then we'll bring this to a close. Thank you once again, everyone, for joining.
Thank you. That was a beautiful presentation.
Thank you, Lou.